Hello and welcome to this week's review of My Hero Academia. This week I'm reviewing the episode together with Shoji. We're going to kick off this review, as we always do with these reviews, by talking about the positives. And it's time for the headline positives once again. I think this was a brilliantly well animated episode. The writing was superb, and I liked the way that it treated a very serious subject matter very respectfully. But more on that later on. But we're going to kick off, going back to standard, by talking about the animation first and foremost. And yes, it turns out I was right. Last week was a taste of things to come. I don't know who's directing this. I don't know who is animating this. I don't know if they switched internal teams or they've had more people working on this stretch of episodes, but I think this looked bloody amazing. I really did love it. The sheer look and dynamism to so much within this episode is just absolutely stellar. Everything has this very distinct look and feel to everyone and everything that we see in this episode, both in terms of the characters themselves but also in the more stylistic moments. I will admit that whilst the cinematography and choreography of certain action sequences and the shot composition was always as high quality as the animation itself, I have to say is that this episode, pound for pound, is head and shoulders above a lot of what we've seen this season. Or the way that this is all put together, the way that this is all presented, it gives this episode a tone, a mood, a character all of its own. Whilst it could have been an episode which is just, oh, let's see what these guys are up to, instead we get this fantastically well put together piece, which is painfully relevant in many ways, but we'll talk about that later on. But I'll be honest, I totally expected that this great visual flair would have just begun and ended with the flashback that we got towards the start of the episode. We would have had this really great opening little animated sequence, and then we'd pivot back into the standard look and feel of things, which, whilst not bad, there always would have been this case of me going, oh gee, I wish everything would have just looked as good as it did in the little flashback sequence. But of course, that whole quality then echoes throughout the rest of the episode. Well, it more than echoes, it runs through it like the rude phrasing within a stick of Blackpool rock. It creates just a really striking episode and helps to elevate it. I will admit that I still feel as though, had this episode been animated in a more conventional way, something we've been more familiar with over the course of this season, it still would have been impactful, but I feel that given the way that certain characters are drawn, how their expressions are presented, their facial expressions, their body language, it creates something that is just brilliant to watch. It's this compelling whole affair that just drills us into it, from the bestial looks that appear on Spinner's face to the looks of pain and emotional anguish on Shoji's face, and the drive and determination that we get on Koda's. Just how everything is all put together and presented, it all looks brilliant and creates this dark, nasty realm, but still within it all there's this spark of hope and optimism that maybe one day things can improve, or if they can't improve, then at least we'll try and make things better at some point or another. I love the way that everything looked within this episode. Yes, there were a couple flashes back here and there to previous episodes where the animation wasn't as good, but that didn't matter. Like the sheer sharp tonal shift that we got from the flashback bit with Spinner going, oh, get them, to all of a sudden, hard cut, everything's on fire, we're in this episode and this time frame now, and everything looks brilliant, is just wow. I think the writing in this episode is brilliant. Apologies, I'm going to use the word brilliant and fantastic and all that kind of stuff over and over again. You just got to deal with it. I love how this episode just unfolds as it goes along. We start out with that flashback and it's presented in such a way that it makes you think that it's Spinner's, only to later reveal that it's actually Shoji's, and that reveal is amazing. I suppose the reason we're supposed to think it's Spinner's is because we got that image of the lizard gecko thing running down the side of the building, and it feels like one of those very subtle hints that, oh, I wonder who it could be. Ooh, maybe it's this guy. Because you know that a less creative writer would do that. A less creative writer would put that as being some kind of skillful, depthful, subversive hint as to, ooh, this is who it's actually about. And that's not what we get here, because subversion, and it's subversion that actually works and makes that whole sequence of events a lot more relevant and a lot more impactful when we realise what is actually going on here. I like the deeper look that we're getting to Shoji and Koda. Admittedly, it is a lot more focused on Shoji throughout this. I will admit that I never really cared much for either character. They always just felt as though they were always in the background. Maybe they get a little fun line here and there. Maybe they get to do something semi-impressive or semi-cool, but outside from that, they were always just these neat-looking characters in the background that had kind of quirky superpowers. But in this episode, they get their time to shine and then some, and I like the way in which this episode just builds them out and makes you feel for them in a way in which you never really did so before. Like I say, for the longest time, for me, these two characters were just background characters. They were the other character in the roster list when if you played one of the video games, and you probably didn't play them because you didn't have a strong feeling about them one way or the other. But now I think they're both brilliant, and I really want to see where all this ends up going over the course of the next episode or so. Shoji, like I said, is the main focus. We see his struggles growing up and how that shaped him, and how he wanted to become the change that he wanted to see in his neighbourhood, and how he never gave in to the pain and the hatred that those that surrounded him would throw upon him in the way that Spinner ultimately ended up doing so. And we see this contrast between the two characters about how both of them have been shaped and moulded by the pain, the trauma and the bigotry that they've grown up with, and just how that ended up changing them as time has gone by. And I do feel as though we are missing something of a deeper look into Spinner's backstory. I have a feeling that that is something that we may well see in next week's episode, but either way, I think that's the only missing element that we get. There has been hints to it here and there. There was in the previous season, which was supposed to be part of the season before that, if we were going off the manga timelining of it all, but still, I really did like this look into it. Or I liked it as much as you can like something like this, given the subject matter. I thought that it was this fascinating look, this fine compare and contrast between these two characters about how they are both indicative of the world in which they grew up in, as are so many of the characters that we see in this series. They are shaped by their life experiences, they are shaped by the world around them, and we're now starting to see that moulding of them over the course of the lifespans up until this particular moment. I will say is I don't think that Spinner is long for this world. I feel that the mention of Nomu towards the start of the episode is something of a hint as to where things are going. Yes, that is meant as an explanation as what Nomu are and as to the importance of, I forget the name, Kurogiri or whatever the name is. I understand that that's the textual reason for putting that there. Because let's face it, this series does love to explain stuff that we already know, and they explain it several weeks on the bounce, particularly in the case of Vigilantes, but that's a discussion for all of a time. But I do think that that is presented in such a way that it gives something of a nod as to what Spinner is essentially turning into. Yes, he's not literally becoming a Nomu, but he is becoming a similar kind of tool. He's becoming a means to an end. I don't think for one square moment that All For One really gives a damn as to what happens with Spinner. Spinner is just a means to an end for him, and regardless of whether or not this was going to be the big final battle for the villains, I think that this attack was still going to go on, and hey, if Spinner survived it, great. If not, well, then he becomes a martyr for this cause, and then things can boil out from there. But you know, I don't think that if All For One suddenly got the call and said, Spinner's dead, I don't think he's going to be shedding many tears. The stuff that we got with Koda was great as well. I think that he does play second fiddle with most of this episode. But I do like the fact that we see this otherwise mild-mannered dweeb getting his time to shine. Quite literally, when we just see the light pouring out of his head. I thought at first that was just being a kind of neat little, if slightly awkwardly placed scene transition. Which it still was. I mean, from a productional point of view, it's just that it soon became clear that that wasn't quite the case. And it is a reflection of how he has grown and changed and how he's maturing and focusing his mind now as he becomes more of the hero that he always wanted to be, and he's wanting to stand out and prove himself and to be the counterpoint to the stuff, the spinner and the guys shouting out on the rooftops and trying to gear up the crowd is time to do. And this all wraps up with something of a power boost of sorts and a not too obscure cine-literate reference. I think that all that stuff is fantastic. Would have liked a little bit more with Koda, but this episode was about Shoji and about Spinner and showing the contrast between how their lives have shaped them and how they've brought them into this particular moment in their lives. This episode is one that is painfully relevant. Now, I'm not going to lean too hard into the real world parallels of what this episode is echoing, because that is simply not what this channel is about. I'm sure there's other channels that are doing more of a deep dive into that, so by all means watch, listen, read, all that kind of stuff. But this is still an episode that at the heart of it is well, it's not really subtext at this point, it's pretty much the text of the episode is about bigotry and discrimination and the lifelong effects that that can have on an individual and the generational trauma that can come from that. This is not an uncommon subtext or theme from superhero fiction. It's something that comes up many times, particularly when we look at the X-Men series. The mutant struggle in that series has always been an allegory for a whole range of different social struggles depending on the era in which that particular run of the comics is coming out in. What we get here within this particular series and how it deals with all of this is done in a very fair and matter-of-fact way. The discrimination that the Hetramorphs have in this world is real. We have seen hints to it in the past, but in this episode we get very specific references to horrific things that that community, that a group have gone through, attacks, riots and so forth. And this episode, thankfully, does not end with and that's why we all became friends in the end, and we all learnt that at the end of the day, it's what's inside that counts. You know, in that Saturday morning cartoon-esque way that it would do. And in the episode itself, Shoji bluntly reflects on the fact that everything that the Hetramorphs are going through is not something that's going to be solved by them. It's going to take generations, that their job as heroes is to make sure that children don't have the same scars that they had and that they have happy memories where they couldn't have. And I think that that is a fantastic statement. I really do like that line. That isn't the line itself, as you point out, that's me paraphrasing it, but that whole moment, the whole scene where he's reflecting upon his past experiences and why he's doing it and why he wants to make life better, I think is brilliant. There are many other finer points within this episode and how it presents this specific theme that I would like to cover in greater depth, but again, this isn't what the channel is, and I'm not going to start pivoting the channel to being about that. But I have a ton of respect for how it dealt with that subject matter. And again, it does not boil this all down into some kind of binary superhero Saturday morning cartoon thing. It deals with the reality of that subject matter in an incredibly respectful way. I will be interested to see where they ultimately end up going with all of this, as I always am with all these things, but I really have to take my hat off, because I'll be honest, when I saw all this stuff starting to kick off within this storyline, there was a part of me that was worried, okay, so where exactly are we going with this, and how are we all going to feel when it's reached its conclusion? But hey, it's all going fantastically well, at least from a writing point of view, even if it's not going fantastically well for the characters. With that said, let us pivot into the negatives, and I have to say I don't have many. Like, the closest thing to well, there's only two things I've come up with, and one of them isn't really negative, so I might as well say it in the here and now. The little, like, comic relief moment with the characters talking with Shoji, I was fine with that. I don't have any major issues with that. It does feel as though maybe the wacky sound effects weren't really needed. I think the presentation of that scene needed to be slightly different, particularly given the emotional significance of it. But still, with an episode as heavy as this, that's going into subject matter as heavy as this, the fact that we have a moment of levity within it is something I'm not going to begrudge the episode on. And the use of a wacky sound effect, I don't think is to condemn the episode over. The only other negative that I have, again, is a very nitpicky thing. It's towards the start of the episode when we have the bait and switch with whose flashback it is. we have what we think is Spinner going down to the river, and then we get the hard cut of the kind of creepy headshot of Spinner. Looks great, apart from the teeth. The teeth almost make him look like a Garfield character. Just the weird way that they're drawn. I think the teeth should have been a little bit sharper, a little bit more angular. Instead, it just makes him look like a character out of the Peanuts or something. Again, nitpicky stuff. But with that said, let us get into the overview, and I have to say that this is a fantastic episode. This is one of those situations where it's kind of hard to really talk about it, so forgive me if this ultimately boils down to a rather short episode, because it just does everything that it needs to spectacularly, in a way which is hard for me to discuss, because it does it all so bloody well. This is one of those situations where everything within it just stands up and speaks for itself in such a compelling and focused way that there's no reasonable way here that I could spin this out to something longer, because it would be an asinine waste of time. The episode is fantastic. It is great fun. I say it's great fun. I think it is definitely a very stimulating, a very fascinating episode. I think that this is probably one of the best episodes we've had thus far this season, which is coming off another episode which I thought at the time was probably one of the best episodes we had this season. So as far as that's concerned, I think that for the sake of everyone, this season is starting to find its footing, even if we're only about 7 weeks away from the end of the series. And it did occur to me that, actually, no, it doesn't matter, Maybe it's something I'll discuss in the comments, I don't know. But anyway, with all that said, let us now move into Comment Corner! It's time for Comment Corner. You know what, I'll discuss why I was laughing in just a moment. Anyway, time for Comment Corner, and we kick off once again with Big X1, who says, and this is in reference to last week's episode, "This is probably my favourite episode this season. It looked amazing. Thank you for your comment." And yes, last week's episode looked amazing, though I think that this episode looks even better, because it does, pound for pound, feel a lot more like a complete entity. We then move on to Scott TV Gamer, once again back, who says, "I purposely wouldn't say this episode was adapted amazingly, though I do think it's still great overall. Glad you liked it. Thank you very much." And I really did like last week's episode, and I really like this one as well. So why I was laughing, just very quickly, I was just thinking, like, just how different things have gone. Like, it's Saturday morning and I'm watching an animated series, some really deep and heavy stuff going in it, and I'm just thinking, yeah, about 20 years ago, I'd just been watching, like, I don't know, Timon and Pumbaa or something. I'll be watching some innocuous, inane, light-hearted Saturday morning cartoon, and now here I am, 20 years later, watching this. It's amazing how these things can turn out. Anyway, thank you all for watching. Thank you all for listening. Leave me a comment down below. Let me know what you thought about this episode. Like, subscribe, do all that kind of stuff. And thank you all for doing that. For those of you who've done so thus far. Thank you all, and see you next time. Goodbye! Thanks for watching. Be sure to like, favourite, subscribe, click the bell, and do all the YouTubey stuff that YouTube wants you to do. Go on, it'll do me a power of good. Until next time, my friends, goodbye!